When I frantically searched for my late wife's old acoustic guitar, the only thing left that still held her warmth and her fingerprints. My son had his legs crossed on the sofa and calmly announced, "I sold it. I needed the deposit to trade up to a new Tesla." Stunned, frozen by the cruelty of it, I rushed downtown to the vintage instrument shop to buy it back. The owner stared at me and lowered his voice. "Sir, you won't believe what we found in the hidden drawer under the guitar case." A secret buried for 5 years was about to strip away my family's true face and teach me a bloody lesson about what family really means. Before we go deeper into this story, please hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me what state or country you're watching from tonight. My name is Warrick Colton. I am 68 years old, and for 31 years I was the chief architect at one of the largest firms in Seattle, the man other men called when a building needed to stand for 100 years without cracking, without settling, without a single hairline fracture in its foundation. I built things that lasted. I spent my whole career making sure of it. I never once imagined that the one thing I couldn't hold on to, in the end, would be a guitar. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of low, gray Seattle morning where the clouds sit right on top of the water and everything smells like rain that hasn't quite decided to fall yet. I walked into the reading room off the east hallway, the room Marion used to call her quiet corner, the room where the good afternoon light came through the bay window and warmed the old rug, and I stopped dead in the doorway with my coffee cup halfway to my mouth. The stand by the window was empty. The dust outline of the case was still pressed into the carpet fibers, a clean rectangle surrounded by 5 years of neglect, 5 years of nobody vacuuming that corner because nobody wanted to disturb it. But the guitar itself, the 1950 Martin D28 that Marion had bought with her very first paycheck as a 23-year-old nurse, the guitar she'd played every single Sunday evening of our 40 years together, humming old folk songs while I did the crossword in the armchair across from her, was gone. I set the coffee down on the windowsill with a hand that had gone strangely, suddenly cold. I checked behind the armchair on the off chance it had simply been moved. I checked the hallway closet, pushing winter coats aside one by one, my breath coming faster with every empty hanger that swung and clicked against the rod. I checked the front closet by the door. Nothing. My heart was hammering by the time I made it to the top of the basement stairs, where my son Tucker had been living rent-free in the finished lower level for 3 years now, ever since Marion passed, and I'd told him in a moment of grief-soaked generosity I now deeply regretted, that he and his family could stay as long as they needed. I stood at the bottom of those stairs and listened to the tinny explosions of a video game blaring through his closed door. In the kitchen, my 7-year-old grandson Milo sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the television, controller in his small hands, utterly oblivious to the world. My daughter-in-law Miranda stood at the counter, scrolling through her phone with one thumb, an untouched cup of coffee going cold beside her elbow, her expression the particular blank mask she wore whenever she'd already decided a conversation wasn't worth her full attention. "Miranda," I said, keeping my voice level, though my pulse was pounding in my ears. "Have you seen Marion's guitar? The Martin, from the reading room." She didn't even look up from the screen. "You mean the old wooden one? Tucker sold it." The words didn't land right away. They floated somewhere above my head like a sentence spoken in a language I hadn't quite finished learning. "Sold it," I repeated, my voice cracking slightly on the second word. "Sold it to who? When?" Tucker's door opened at that exact moment, and he came bounding up the basement stairs in gray sweatpants, phone in one hand, a piece of toast in the other, not even breaking stride to look at me directly. "Relax, Dad. I got $4,000 for it. Needed it for the deposit on the new Tesla, the one I showed you pictures of last week. That thing was just sitting up there collecting dust anyway. Nobody's played it in 5 years. My chest went tight, a physical pressure I hadn't felt since the hospital. since those final gray hours I'd spent holding Marion's hand while the machines counted down in their slow, patient rhythm. "That guitar belonged to your mother," I said, and I heard my own voice shaking now. "She played it every single week for 40 years, Tucker. It wasn't collecting dust. It was the last piece of her I had left in that room. And you sold it without asking me a single question." He finally looked up from his phone, and there was nothing behind his eyes but mild, practiced irritation, the look of a grown man being lectured about something he considered far beneath his attention. "Mom's dead, Dad," he said, chewing his toast. "Dead people don't play guitar. Chloe and I are the ones still here, building a life. We're the future, not some old piece of wood in a case nobody even looks at." Miranda made a small sound of agreement without glancing up from her phone, and something in me went very quiet, very still, and very cold. Not the hot flash of anger I might have expected from myself. Cold the way the air goes cold and heavy right before a storm rolls in off the sound. "Which shop?" I said. "Tell me exactly which shop." Tucker shrugged, already turning back toward the stairs, already finished with the conversation. "Some vintage place downtown. Vance Vintage Strings, I think. Guy paid cash, no questions asked. Real quick transaction." I didn't say another word to either of them. I picked up my keys from the bowl by the front door and walked out into the gray, wet morning without looking back once. The drive downtown took 26 minutes, though I couldn't have told you a single traffic light I passed through. My hand stayed steady on the wheel, which surprised me more than almost anything else that morning. I parked outside a narrow storefront wedged between a coffee roaster and a shuttered used bookstore, the windows lined with old fiddles, banjos, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Vance Vintage Strings, established 1978. Inside, the shop smelled like aged spruce and lemon oil and old velvet. A man in his 60s with silver hair and half-moon reading glasses looked up from behind the counter, and something in his expression shifted the instant he saw my face. "You're here about the Martin," he said. It wasn't a question. "My son sold it here yesterday," I said. "I need to buy it back, whatever it costs." He studied me for a long moment, the way a man studies something he's still deciding whether to trust. "I paid him $4,000 for it," he said slowly. "But before you write me a check, sir, I need to tell you something. My name's Elias Vance. I've been restoring old instruments in this shop for almost 50 years, and this morning, before I put it out on the floor, I opened that guitar up on my workbench to check the internal bracing." My pulse climbed sharply. "And what did you find?" "The back panel of the case wasn't original," he said. "Somebody built a false bottom into it a long time ago, and did it well enough that I nearly missed it myself. There's a hidden compartment underneath the padding, and it isn't empty." I gripped the edge of his counter with both hands. "Show me, please." He led me into the back workroom, where the Martin sat cradled in a velvet-lined stand under a bright work lamp, its honey-colored spruce top glowing warm, exactly the way I remembered it glowing in Marion's hands on 100 quiet Sunday evenings. I wrote him a check for $8,000 without a flicker of hesitation, twice what he had paid Tucker, and he tried to wave off half of it before I insisted, firmly, that he keep every dollar. Then, with hands far steadier than mine, he lifted the padded lining at the base of the case and gently pried loose a thin wooden panel underneath. 2 things lay hidden there: a small brass key, the unmistakable kind used for a bank safety deposit box, with the number 4417 stamped into its worn handle, and beside it, a small leather notebook. Its cover soft and cracked from years of quiet handling, tied shut with a faded ribbon I recognized instantly, the same ribbon Marion used to wear, pinned in her hair on Sunday evenings while she played. My hands were shaking as I lifted the notebook free. On the inside cover, in Marion's careful, familiar handwriting, the very same handwriting that had signed my birthday cards and grocery lists for 4 decades, were the words that made the shop, the wet street outside, the entire gray Seattle morning go completely silent around me. Warrick, if you are reading this, it means Tucker has finally crossed the last line I always hoped, prayed he never would. I stood there in Elias Vance's back room holding my dead wife's handwriting in my two hands, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that everything I thought I knew about my own family was about to come apart at the seams. I didn't drive home right away. I sat in my truck in front of Vance Vintage Strings for almost 20 minutes, with the little leather notebook open on my lap, reading and rereading that first line until the ink seemed to burn itself into the back of my eyes. Then I turned to the second page, and I found the address of a bank branch downtown, along with a single instruction written in Marion's careful hand. Go there alone, Warrick. Don't tell them where you're going. Don't tell them anything at all. The bank on 4th Avenue was a tall glass building I had walked past 1,000 times in 30 years without ever once thinking about what it might be quietly holding for me. I showed the brass key and my identification to a young woman at the front desk, and she led me down a narrow staircase into the vault, past long rows of numbered steel drawers, until she found box 441 Benzine, slid it free, carried it into a small private room, and left me alone with it. My hands were unsteady again as I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a plain manila envelope, was cash, stacks of it, bound tightly with rubber bands. More money in one place than I had ever seen outside of a teller's drawer in my entire life. I counted it twice because I didn't trust the number the first time through. $85,000. Underneath the cash sat a folded stack of pages, a letter far longer than anything Marion had ever written me while she was alive, and I lowered myself into the small metal chair in that windowless room and began to read. My dearest Warrick, the letter began, if you're holding this, it means I finally lost the quiet fight I've been waging for the last 3 years of my life, and it means something happened, with Tucker or with Chloe, that finally forced you to come looking for the truth. I am so sorry I couldn't say any of this to your face while I still had the chance, but every single time I tried you found some new reason to defend him. And I understood why, Warrick. He is your son. I loved him too once, before I watched what he slowly became. I read faster with every line, my chest tightening, my eyes stinging. Marion wrote about a spring afternoon 3 years before her diagnosis when she'd caught Tucker standing at my desk with 3 blank checks pulled from the drawer, halfway through forging my signature out on the first one. She confronted him right there in the study. He begged her not to tell me, swore up and down it was a one-time mistake, a moment of desperation over some gambling debt he refused to fully explain. She let it go that day, she wrote, because she still believed people could change if you gave them one honest chance to prove it. She never gave him a second chance to prove her wrong, because she never once told me, and because she began instead, quietly and methodically, moving small amounts of our savings out of our joint accounts and into a private box that only she controlled. She wrote about Chloe next, and this part of the letter made my hands go cold in an entirely different way. Chloe, she wrote, had asked her more than once, in casual, offhand conversation over dishes or folding laundry, exactly how much our pension and retirement accounts were worth, and exactly what would happen to the house if anything ever happened to me. Marion described one particular Thanksgiving dinner 2 years before her diagnosis, when Chloe had laughed and said, half joking and half not, that it seemed like such a waste for 2 people to be sitting on a house that size when they could downsize and let the kids finally get a head start in life. Marion wrote that she had smiled and quietly changed the subject that night, the way she always did. But she never once forgot the quick, calculating flicker that crossed Chloe's face in the half-second before that smile came back. The final page was the one that stayed with me longest, the one I read 4 times before I could make myself fold the letter and stand up. Warrick, she wrote, you spent your whole career thinking like an architect. You never once make a real decision without a plan, without measurements, without understanding exactly what a structure can bear before it fails under the load. I need you to use that same mind now on our own family, because I won't be there beside you to help you see it clearly. Don't let grief make you soft in the one place in your life you can no longer afford to be soft. If Tucker ever crosses the line I have always quietly feared he would cross, tear the whole rotten structure down, all of it, and rebuild your life on solid ground. You still have time, my love. Please, for both of us, use it for yourself. I sat alone in that small windowless room for a long while after I finished reading, the letter resting across my knees, the $85,000 still sitting untouched in its envelope beside me. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that room, because it wasn't grief exactly, and it wasn't only anger either. Something in my chest that had stayed soft and yielding for 5 straight years, ever since I buried my wife and quietly told myself that loneliness meant I owed my son whatever he asked of me, went hard and still and permanent, the way wet concrete finally sets once the wooden forms come off and there's nothing left to hold its shape but itself. I didn't cry that day. I had already done all my crying, years of it, inside that same house where Tucker now slept, until noon on my dime, and Chloe charged designer handbags to accounts I quietly covered. What I felt instead, sitting there with Marion's careful handwriting across my knees, was something closer to clarity, the particular cold clarity of an engineer finally looking at a structural drawing and understanding, at last, exactly where the crack had started and exactly how far it had already spread through the foundation while he wasn't watching. I drove home a different man than the one who had left that gray morning 3 hours earlier. Over the following 2 weeks, I said nothing to Tucker or Chloe about the guitar, the notebook, or the money. I let them believe I had simply let it go, the way I always had before, the way I'd let go of every small betrayal for 3 straight years because keeping the peace felt easier than confronting the people I had left. Instead, in the quiet hours after they went to bed each night, I began treating my own family exactly the way I had once treated a building with a suspected structural flaw. I gathered every piece of data before I ever trusted my instincts again. I pulled 3 years of bank statements from the filing cabinet in my study and spread them across my drafting table under the good lamp, the same lamp I'd used for 40 years of blueprints. I built a spreadsheet the way I used to build load calculations, 1 column for every loan I'd quietly handed Tucker over the years, $500 here for a car repair, $1,200 there for what he'd called, with a straight face, an investment opportunity. Small amounts that never felt significant on their own, but that added together and totaled with a single formula made my stomach drop. $42,300 loaned out over 3 years, with a repayment column that contained nothing but zeros, every single row. I found Chloe's credit card statements mixed into a stack of mail she'd been quietly having sent to my address without ever asking permission, and I photographed every single page. A $4,000 weekend trip to Cabo, a 4-figure charge at a jewelry boutique downtown, recurring monthly charges tied to my own utility accounts that had never once, in 3 years, been reimbursed by a single dollar. And late one Thursday night, after I'd confirmed that Washington State allows recording with the consent of just one party in a conversation, and after I'd made absolutely certain of my legal footing, I ordered 2 small security cameras online, disguised as ordinary smoke detectors, and installed them myself, quietly and carefully, in the living room and the kitchen, the 2 rooms where my family spent the most time, believing themselves completely unwatched. I felt no guilt installing them. This was still my house, built with 31 years of my own work and paid off with my own 2 hands, and I had every right in the world to know exactly what was happening inside it. I was simply, finally, gathering the measurements I needed before I decided precisely how to rebuild. I found Vera Langston's name through the State Bar Association's referral line, listed under elder law, with a rating I couldn't ignore, and 3 decades of experience behind it. Her office sat on the 9th floor of a glass tower downtown, all clean lines and quiet, expensive efficiency. And when I walked in carrying a thick folder of bank statements, photographs, and Marion's letter tucked carefully inside a manila sleeve, she looked up from her desk with sharp gray eyes that seemed to take in everything about me in a single, unhurried pass. "Mr. Colton," she said, gesturing to the leather chair across from her desk, "sit down and tell me exactly what's happening in your house." I told her everything, start to finish. The guitar, the false bottom in the case, the notebook, the $85,000 in the safety deposit box, the $42,300 in unpaid loans I'd traced through 3 years of statements, the cameras I'd already installed in the living room and kitchen. She listened without interrupting a single time, taking careful notes in tight, precise handwriting, and when I finally finished, she set down her pen and studied me for a long, quiet moment. "Most clients come to me wanting an eviction filed the same week," she said. "That instinct is completely understandable, and I've seen it 100 times, but it's the wrong move. If we act too quickly, any competent attorney on their side will paint this as an elderly man acting rashly out of grief and confusion. That's a narrative I refuse to let them build. Instead, we bind them in a legal structure first. Formal terms in writing clearly and demonstrably reasonable. Then we sit back and document exactly how they respond to it. Their own reaction becomes our strongest evidence." "What kind of terms?" I asked. "A month-to-month rental agreement," she said, already pulling a fresh legal pad toward her. $3,000 a month, which I've confirmed is fair market rate for a home in that neighborhood, nothing remotely punitive about it. On top of that, a retroactive request for reimbursement of 3 years of utilities they've never once contributed toward. We serve it formally through a licensed process server, so there's an official time-stamped record of the exact date and their exact reaction. From that point forward, whatever they choose to do becomes evidence we can use. I signed her retainer agreement before I left the office that same afternoon. The rental agreement itself was ready within the week. 3 clean pages of careful legal language that I read over twice at my drafting table before approving every clause. Vera scheduled the formal service for a Saturday evening, and though I hadn't asked her office to plan it around any particular occasion, it happened to land on the exact night Chloe had organized an elaborate dinner party in my own dining room, inviting a dozen friends from the country club to celebrate what she kept calling well within my hearing, finally getting the house looking the way it should. I watched from the kitchen doorway as she lit candles down the center of my grandmother's antique dining table, covered now in rented gold chargers and an enormous floral centerpiece that cost, I later learned from a receipt she'd carelessly left on my counter, $640. Her friends arrived in cocktail dresses and sport coats, complimenting the house, complimenting Chloe's taste, not one of them ever thinking to ask who actually owned the walls closing in around their pleasant evening. Tucker poured wine for the table and told an animated story about his upcoming Tesla delivery, laughing too loud at his own jokes, playing the part of a man who had built something with his own 2 hands rather than sold his dead mother's guitar to make a down payment. Milo sat quietly at the far end of the table between 2 adults who ignored him entirely, pushing food around his plate, and I remember thinking, watching him from the doorway, that he was the only innocent person in that room. The knock came at 8:15, right in the middle of the second course. I opened the door myself before anyone else could reach it. A woman in a plain gray blazer stood on the porch with a leather folder tucked under one arm, entirely unbothered by the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifting out behind me. "I'm looking for Tucker Colton and Chloe Colton," she said clearly, her voice carrying easily into the dining room. "I have documents to serve tonight." The table went silent almost instantly. Tucker appeared in the hallway first, wine glass still in his hand, his easy dinner-party smile already faltering at the edges. "What is this? Who are you?" The woman handed him the folder without ceremony or apology. "Formal notice of a month-to-month rental agreement for the property at this address, effective immediately, along with an itemized request for reimbursement of unpaid utilities covering the past 3 years. You have 30 days to respond in writing." Chloe appeared just behind him, reading over his shoulder, her face draining of color line by line until she reached the dollar figure at the bottom of the second page. $3,000 a month, she said, her carefully composed voice climbing high enough for every guest at that table to hear clearly. "Plus back payments? This has to be some kind of joke. This is our home." "It's my home," I said quietly from the doorway, and I felt every single eye in that dining room turn toward me at once. "It has always been my home. I built the back addition with my own 2 hands in 1998. I paid off the mortgage myself in 2011. My name is the only name on the deed, and it always has been." Tucker's face went a deep, furious shade of red. He set his wineglass down hard enough on the entry table that it cracked cleanly at the stem. "You're doing this now? Tonight, in front of everyone we know? What exactly is wrong with you?" "Nothing is wrong with me," I said, and my voice stayed level, almost gentle. "I simply expect finally to be treated like the owner of my own property, which I have not been for 3 straight years." Chloe's carefully composed dinner party voice cracked entirely apart. "We are your family, Warrick. We are your rightful heirs. You cannot possibly serve us legal papers like we're strangers pulled off the street." One of her friends near the end of the table quietly folded her napkin, reached for her husband's arm, and murmured something about the hour. Within a handful of minutes, the entire party had begun gathering coats and purses, offering polite, hollow excuses, filing out past me toward the driveway with expressions I couldn't fully read, embarrassment or curiosity or something closer to quiet relief at having somewhere else to be. Chloe stood alone in the wreckage of her $600 centerpiece and watched every last guest disappear into the dark. Tucker rounded on me the second the front door clicked shut behind them. "You humiliated us. In our own house. In front of everyone we know." "It isn't your house," I said, and I was almost surprised myself at how calm my voice sounded, how steady. The particular calm of a man who has finally stopped negotiating with his own conscience. "You have 30 days to either sign the agreement or make other arrangements. Both options are entirely reasonable, and both are entirely yours to decide." Chloe's eyes filled with furious, glittering tears. "Where exactly are we supposed to go, Warrick? We have nowhere else." "I don't know," I said honestly, "but it will not remain a problem I keep solving for you indefinitely." I climbed the stairs to my bedroom that night and stopped at the top, looking down at the wreckage of the dinner party still scattered across my dining room, gold chargers and half-finished wine glasses, and a centerpiece nobody would ever reimburse me for. And I said the last words I intended to say on the subject that night, quiet enough that I still don't know if either of them fully heard me. "In this house," I said, "my name on the deed is the only law that matters anymore. You have 30 days. Then I turned and walked into my room, and for the first time in 3 long years, I closed my bedroom door behind me without the smallest flicker of guilt. The 30 days passed in a strange, tense quiet that settled over the house like weather. Tucker and Chloe didn't sign the rental agreement, and they didn't move out either. They simply stopped speaking to me almost entirely, communicating instead through slammed doors, pointed silences at the dinner table, and the occasional muttered comment just loud enough for me to catch as I passed through a room, as though refusing to acknowledge me directly might somehow make the paperwork on Vera's desk quietly disappear on its own. On day 26, I came downstairs for coffee and found a strange man in a gray cardigan sitting at my kitchen table with a clipboard balanced on his knee, speaking quietly with Chloe while Tucker hovered behind her chair with his arms crossed. "Mr. Colton," the man said, standing to shake my hand with a practiced, professional warmth that immediately set every nerve in my body on edge. "I'm Dr. Reeves, a neuropsychologist. Your son and daughter-in-law mentioned some concerns about your recent decision-making and asked me to stop by for a brief cognitive screening. Purely a formality, nothing at all to worry about. I understood in that instant, with total and sudden clarity, exactly what was unfolding in my own kitchen. They weren't trying to help me. They were building a paper trail toward having me declared incompetent, hoping to seize control of the house and the accounts before the 30-day rental window forced their hand entirely. I looked at Tucker, who wouldn't meet my eyes, and then at Chloe, whose face was already arranged into a careful, performative mask of concern. "I appreciate the thought," I said calmly, keeping my voice perfectly even, "but I already have documentation of my own, thank you. If you'll excuse me, Doctor, I have a call to make." I walked past all three of them, climbed the stairs to my study, and called Vera Langston from my desk phone with hands that surprised me by staying steady. She listened without interrupting, then let out a short, sharp laugh that carried no humor in it at all. "They're trying to move against your competency before the rental deadline forces their hand," she said. "It's an old, predictable tactic, and it's about to backfire on them spectacularly. Do you remember the neurologist I recommended you see 3 weeks ago when I first warned you something like this might happen?" I did remember. On her advice, weeks earlier, I had quietly undergone a full cognitive evaluation with one of the top neurologists practicing in Seattle, a comprehensive battery of tests that concluded, in a formal written physician's letter, that I was fully competent, mentally sharp, and entirely capable of managing my own financial and legal affairs without any assistance whatsoever. I hadn't understood at the time why Vera had insisted on it so urgently. Now I understood completely. She had seen this exact move coming long before I ever could have imagined it myself, and she had made certain I was already standing on solid ground before Tucker even thought to swing. Dr. Reeves left my kitchen 20 minutes later without ever administering a single test, visibly uncomfortable, promising vaguely to circle back once he'd reviewed my existing records. He never called again. I sent the neurologist's full report to my bank the following morning, along with a formal written letter instructing them to immediately flag any attempt by Tucker or Chloe to access my accounts or claim power of attorney on my behalf under any circumstance. 2 days later, the bank's fraud department called to inform me that Tucker had, in fact, attempted exactly that, walking into a downtown branch that same afternoon and claiming I had verbally granted him full authority over my finances. The teller, following the flag already sitting on my account, denied the request on the spot and quietly reported the attempt as potential elder financial fraud to their internal compliance office. I asked for the incident report in writing. It arrived by email within the hour, another brick laid carefully into the wall Vera and I were building. I forwarded that notification straight to Vera the moment I received it. Her response came back within minutes. "This is exactly what we needed, Warrick. Keep documenting every single thing. Don't confront them about it. Let them keep making mistakes on their own." That same week I noticed small things shifting around the house that told me the mask on both of them was slipping further by the day. Milo asked me quietly one evening while his parents argued in low, furious voices behind their bedroom door whether I was going to have to leave. I told him no, and I meant it, but I also understood, watching his small, worried face in the hallway light, exactly how much collateral damage this fight was already causing to the one person in that house who deserved none of it at all. The final break came on a Tuesday evening, 11 days after the failed cognitive screening attempt. I was walking down the upstairs hallway toward my bedroom when Tucker stepped directly into my path, blocking the narrow space between the wall and the top of the stairs, close enough that I could smell whiskey on him even in the dim light. "We need to talk about this rental nonsense," he said, his voice low and hard in a register I had never once heard from him before, not even as an angry teenager slamming doors. "We've already talked about it," I said, keeping my voice level. "You have 4 days left, Tucker. You really think you're just going to throw us out? Take everything Mom and I built in this house together?" "Your mother built nothing with you in this house," I said quietly. "She built it with me, over 40 years of her own life. And you sold the one single thing she ever specifically asked you to hold on to after she was gone. Something in his face broke open at that. Some final restraint giving way all at once, all his practiced charm collapsing into something raw and ugly. He shoved me hard, both hands flat against my chest, and I stumbled backward against the hallway wall, my shoulder striking the corner of a framed photograph of Marion that had hung there for 15 years, knocking it crooked against the plaster. "You don't have much time left, old man," he said, leaning in close enough that I could feel his breath. "Don't push me. You have absolutely no idea what I'm capable of when I'm cornered." I said nothing at all. I reached out and straightened the crooked picture frame with a hand that, remarkably, did not shake, walked past him into my bedroom, and closed the door quietly behind me. Then I opened my laptop, pulled the footage from the hallway camera I had installed weeks earlier, and watched it once, all the way through. My own son's hands making clear, unmistakable contact with my chest, his threat captured in crisp, undeniable 4K clarity from a lens disguised as a smoke detector he had walked beneath 100 times without ever once looking up. I sent the clip to Vera Langston at 9:40 that same evening. She called me back within 4 minutes, her voice sharper and more urgent than I had ever heard it in our short acquaintance. "Don't sleep in that house tonight," she said. "I'm filing for an emergency protective order first thing tomorrow morning, but I want you somewhere completely safe right now, and I want that video backed up on at least 3 separate devices before you do another single thing." I checked into a hotel 3 miles from the house that night, the footage saved to my phone, my laptop, and an email draft addressed to myself, and I lay awake in an unfamiliar bed thinking about Marion's letter, about her voice telling me in her own careful handwriting not to let grief make me soft in the one place I could no longer afford to be soft. By morning, Vera had already filed the emergency petition with the court, attaching the neurologist's competency letter alongside the video as a single unified exhibit. By that same evening, a judge had reviewed the footage and signed a temporary restraining order requiring Tucker to remain at least 50 feet from me at all times, with immediate arrest as the consequence for any violation whatsoever. The war I hadn't wanted, hadn't started, and had never once asked for had officially, finally become real. I met with Vera 3 days after the restraining order was signed, and I told her something I hadn't fully admitted even to myself until the words actually left my mouth in her office. "I want to sell the house." She set down her coffee cup slowly, studying me over the rim. "That's a significant decision, Warrick. You've lived there 30 years, built the back addition yourself, if I remember correctly." "I know exactly how long I've lived there," I said, "and I know exactly what that house has quietly become. A trophy Tucker has been circling for 3 years now, waiting for me to either die or give up, so he can gut it, remodel it, and post pictures of it online like he built it with his own hands. I refuse to give him the satisfaction of ever getting close to it again, in this life or the next one." I called a real estate contact Vera recommended, a woman named Priya, who specialized in difficult, high-conflict sales, and within a week she'd brought in a representative from a development company called Redwood Land Partners, a firm that had spent the last decade quietly acquiring older single-family lots across the neighborhood and clearing them, one at a time, for modern condominium builds. I walked their site engineer through the house myself on a Saturday morning while Tucker and Chloe were out, watching him measure the lot lines and photograph the foundation with a flat, professional indifference that felt strangely like exactly the right ending for that particular house. Standing in the empty reading room that morning, in the exact spot where the guitar stand used to sit by the window, I let myself feel the full weight of the decision one last time. 40 years of my life had happened inside these walls. Marion's laugh in the kitchen, Tucker's first steps across that same hardwood floor. None of it changed the fact that the man Tucker had become no longer deserved to inherit a single square foot of it. Grief and justice, I was learning, could occupy the same room without canceling each other out. They offered full asking price in cash, no contingencies, with a closing date only 6 weeks out. I signed the paperwork in Priya's office 2 days later, and I felt nothing but a clean, quiet satisfaction watching my own steady signature go down on the final page. The house Tucker had spent 3 years quietly circling, the house he had told his own son would obviously belong to him one day, was going to be reduced to a foundation excavation within 6 months of closing, replaced by 42 condominium units with a rooftop garden neither of us would ever see finished. The for sale sign went up on the front lawn the following Monday. I watched from the study window as Tucker's truck pulled into the driveway that evening, watched him sit motionless behind the wheel for a full minute before finally getting out and staring at the sign like it might rearrange itself into something else if he looked at it long enough. He never came inside to confront me about it directly. There was nothing left for him to argue, and some small, quiet part of him seemed to already understand that. The courtroom on the day of the eviction hearing was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and quiet, with Judge Alvarez presiding, a woman with sharp eyes, and, according to Vera, very little patience for theatrics of any kind. Tucker and Chloe sat across the narrow aisle with an attorney I recognized from the earlier failed guardianship attempt, a heavy-set man who kept glancing down at his phone even as the bailiff called the room to order. Vera walked the judge through the evidence methodically, in the same measured, unhurried way she did everything. She played the hallway footage first, the moment Tucker's hands made hard contact with my chest, his words about how little time I had left echoing clearly through the small courtroom speakers. Judge Alvarez's expression didn't change at all, but her pen stopped moving entirely for the full length of the clip. Next came the spreadsheet, $42,300 in unpaid loans laid out in stark, undeniable columns across 3 years, followed by the bank's written fraud report, detailing Tucker's attempt to claim power of attorney he had never legally been granted. Then came the neurologist's competency letter, dated weeks before the fake cognitive screening attempt, time-stamped proof that I had anticipated their move before they had ever fully made it themselves. Vera closed her presentation by reading a single short passage aloud from Marion's letter, the line about tearing down a rotten structure and rebuilding on solid ground, and I watched Judge Alvarez's pen go still a second time. Tucker's attorney tried to argue that the physical contact had been an emotional moment between a father and his son under enormous stress, and that the financial support I'd provided over the years had been given freely, without any expectation of repayment. Judge Alvarez cut him off with a single raised hand before he could finish the sentence. "Counsel, I've watched that footage twice now," she said. "I don't see an emotional moment. I see an able-bodied man in his 40s physically assaulting his 68-year-old father in his own hallway, and then verbally threatening him immediately afterward. Combined with the documented financial exploitation and the attempted fraudulent access to his bank accounts, this is not, in any sense, a close case." She granted the eviction with a 72-hour compliance window, made the temporary restraining order permanent, and ordered Tucker to complete a court-mandated anger management program as a condition of avoiding any further legal action against him. Chloe cried openly at the defense table, her shoulders shaking. Tucker stared straight ahead at nothing at all, his jaw locked tight, refusing to look in my direction even once through the entire reading of the verdict. The bailiff read the terms of the order aloud a second time for the record, slowly, so there could be no confusion later about the 72-hour window or the permanent distance requirement, and I sat perfectly still in the gallery and listened to every word land, one by one, like nails driven cleanly into a beam I'd spent months carefully measuring and squaring. Vera reached over and pressed my hand once, briefly, the closest thing to a celebration either of us allowed ourselves inside that courtroom. Outside the courtroom, in the wide marble hallway, Chloe caught up to me before Vera could steer me gently toward the elevators. "Please," she said, her voice raw and desperate, in a way I hadn't heard from her in years, maybe ever. "We have nowhere to go, Warrick. Milo has nowhere to go. Please, think about your grandson before you do this." I looked at her for a long moment, and I thought about Marion's letter, about the Thanksgiving dinner she had described so carefully in her own handwriting, about the calculating flicker Chloe had never quite managed to hide from my wife, even when she believed no one else in that room was watching closely enough to notice. "I have thought about Milo," I said, "which is exactly why I've already set aside a separate education account in his name, one that neither of you will ever have access to for any reason. But this was never his fight, and it was never mine to keep losing on his behalf indefinitely. You built this exact outcome yourselves, one choice at a time, over 3 straight years, and no amount of tears in a courthouse hallway is going to rewrite that history now. The dead don't play guitar," I added quietly, watching her flinch visibly at her own husband's words repeated back to her in my voice. "And parasites don't inherit anything at all." I walked past both of them without waiting for any response, out through the tall glass doors and into the gray Seattle afternoon. And for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, the air outside that courthouse felt like it belonged entirely, finally, to me alone. Vera caught up with me at the top of the courthouse steps and simply said quietly that she'd seen 100 families come apart in her career and rarely seen one document its own unraveling so thoroughly, so I would never have to wonder later whether I had done the right thing. The 72 hours passed exactly as the order specified. I stayed with an old colleague from my firm, a man named Roy who'd retired 2 years before me and never once asked an uncomfortable question during the 4 nights I slept on his guest bed. And when I finally returned to the house on the 3rd evening, a rented truck stood in the driveway, half loaded, hazard lights blinking in the dusk. Chloe stood on the front steps, directing 2 exhausted movers, while Tucker carried boxes past me without a single word, his jaw still locked in that same furious tension I'd watched all through the courthouse verdict 3 days earlier. I stood at the edge of my own driveway and watched them for a while, not to gloat, but because some part of me needed to see it through to the end, to witness the final measurements of a structure finally being dismantled. Chloe caught my eye once across the yard, opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again and turned back toward the truck. Tucker never looked at me at all. By 9 that evening, the truck pulled away down the street, taillights shrinking into the dark, and the house behind me went completely, blessedly silent for the first time in 3 years. I learned later through Milo, who called me twice a week from a friend's borrowed phone, because I refused to let this whole fight cost me my grandson entirely, that they'd found a small basement apartment on the far side of the city, the kind of place with a single narrow window at street level and a landlord who required first, last, and a deposit up front before he'd even hand over the keys. Chloe deleted most of her social media accounts within the month, unable to explain to her old circle of country club friends why the house, the parties, the entire curated version of her life had simply disappeared overnight without warning. Tucker, Milo told me quietly one Sunday, had finally taken a full-time job at a warehouse near their new apartment, the first steady work he'd held in nearly 4 years. I felt no real satisfaction in their fall exactly. I want to be honest about that even now. What I felt instead was closer to relief. The particular kind of relief a man feels when he finally sets down a weight he didn't fully realize he'd been carrying until his arms stopped shaking on their own. The sale of the house closed on schedule 2 weeks later, and after paying off Vera's fees and the remaining costs of the entire ordeal, I walked away with just over $900,000, combined with the $85,000 Marion had quietly saved for exactly this moment, all of it sitting in a new account under a bank neither Tucker nor Chloe had ever heard of. I didn't need most of it. I had my pension, my own savings, and 31 years of careful financial planning already behind me. What I actually needed was somewhere entirely new to stand. I found it in Sedona, Arizona, in a 55 and older community built into the Red Rock Hills, a small, smart home with wide, clean windows that face the sunset every single evening without a single tree or fence line anywhere to block the view. I closed on it within a month of the sale, and I spent the following weeks doing something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I built things again with my own two hands for absolutely no one but myself. The second bedroom became a quiet drafting studio, soundproofed and simple, a single drafting table under good light, where I began sketching pro bono blueprints for a small nonprofit that builds accessible homes for elderly veterans, work I now do 3 full days a week, entirely unpaid, entirely by my own choice. The living room held exactly one new piece of furniture, a low leather reading chair positioned precisely where the late afternoon light would land across the floor, and on the wall directly above it, mounted inside a shadow box I built myself from a single piece of walnut, hung Marion's Martin D28, restrung and lovingly restored by Elias Vance himself before I left Seattle for the last time. I never once learned to play it properly while Marion was alive. I always told myself there wasn't time, that it was her instrument, her Sunday evenings alone, not mine to touch or claim. Now, most evenings I take it carefully down from the wall and work through the same handful of simple chords a patient young teacher in town has been showing me since I arrived last spring, my fingers clumsy and slow across strings that still somehow remember the shape of her hands after all these years. I've also made one new friend here, a retired structural engineer named Frank, who lives 2 doors down and beat me soundly at chess 3 times running before I finally took a single game off him. We meet most Thursday afternoons on his patio with 2 glasses of iced tea and a folding board between us, and I have said more honest, unguarded words to him in 6 months than I said to my own son in the last 3 years combined. Before I left Seattle for good, I drove back one last time to Vance Vintage Strings, and Elias walked out from behind his counter to shake my hand properly, no longer just a shopkeeper, but something closer to a friend who had handed me back the one thing I couldn't afford to lose twice. He refused to let me pay him a single dollar for the restringing and the restoration work, and when I tried to argue, he simply said that some instruments deserved to go home properly, and that was payment enough for a man his age. I think about that sentence more often than I expected to. Milo visits every summer now, a standing arrangement Vera helped formalize as part of the final settlement, and last July he sat beside me on the balcony while I fumbled my way through an old folk song Marion used to hum on Sunday evenings. And he told me, with the blunt, unguarded honesty only a 9-year-old can manage, that I was terrible at it, and should probably keep practicing anyway. I laughed harder that particular evening than I had in 5 full years. He asked me once, that same visit, why I kept the guitar on the wall instead of in a case where it would stay safer, and I told him some things are worth the small risk of being seen every day, and he thought about that for a long moment before nodding like it actually made sense to him. Chloe still calls occasionally, from numbers I don't recognize, always right around the anniversary of the eviction. I let every single one of them go to voicemail unheard, then delete them without listening. Not out of cruelty exactly, but because Marion taught me in the end precisely what she meant by that final line in her letter. Don't let grief make you soft in the one place you can no longer afford to be soft. Tonight the sun is going down over the red rocks the way it does every single evening here, orange and gold, and utterly indifferent to anything I ever built or lost or fought so hard to reclaim. My phone buzzes once on the side table, an unknown number, and I let it ring itself, all the way out into silence, without so much as a second glance in its direction. I lift the guitar down from its shadow box instead, settle slowly into the reading chair, and rest my fingers gently across the strings Marion played. Through 40 years of Sunday evenings, I never once thought to join her, for while she was still here, to ask. I pressed down into the first chord, imperfect, and a little sharp at the edges, and something in my chest, something that had stayed braced and cold and vigilant for the better part of a year, finally, completely, lets go all at once. Everything I have left in the end belongs entirely and only to me. And for the first time since I buried my wife 5 years ago, that feels less like a loss than it does like the quiet, solid beginning of something new. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more, and tell me in the comments what you thought. Click the video on the left to watch the next story. Thank you for watching.